Hello everyone, this is just a brief video covering some of the topics that we covered in our Metamorphoses class on September 30th. And it's also going to be a little bit more of a deep dive than we were able to do in class together. I'll walk you through some of the kind of themes that seem to be showing up and sort of the ways that Ovid seems to be using these texts to kind of weave these concepts together. And then you can use that as sort of a springboard to think about your own short assignment. So let's go ahead and get started. You may want to have some note-taking materials. You may want to have your textbook open to the Metamorphoses, that's page 1023. And you may also want to have a copy of the PDF Orpheus and Eurydice story open. So something that I failed to mention the last time that we talked about the Metamorphoses was that Ovid sort of separates his story into four, he calls them ages. Now, we talked about how his stories are kind of thematically split into 6 different parts. You know, there are 15 books, each kind of a mini epic on its own that sort of builds to this larger narrative. But there are also 4 ages as Ovid sees them. So these are the 4 ages of man. First, the Golden Age is when people lived sort of in peace and harmony with nature and also with the divine. So in this, we see a lot of sort of natural harmony. We see sort of better relationships between humans and the divine and sort of humans and gods. And then we see this sort of very paradise kind of view of Earth. Next, we have the Silver Age. And according to Ovid, the Golden Age ended when Zeus defeated his father Kronos and sent him to Tartarus. So in the Silver Age, this is when things like seasons started to happen and people had to start kind of keeping to these natural agricultural cycles. They had to build houses. So this is sort of the split between this kind of idyllic, almost pre-fall state and then this sort of early agricultural state, if we think about it from an anthropological view. Next is the Bronze Age, where people are still kind of having these good relationships with the gods, and then you know, they're still kind of holding to these ideals. But during Ovid's Bronze Age, that's when they invented war and they began to do violence to each other. So then he says that after that came the Iron Age, where everything kind of went wrong. So, you know, that's where he says, you know, we're mining the earth for its minerals, we're cutting down trees, the path of, you know, individual humans, like we don't have like a life's purpose anymore. You know, everybody is being deceitful and violent and greedy. And so for Ovid, he kind of sees this kind of span of history as being one that is sort of a constant downfall of humanity from creation to worse and worse and worse. And he doesn't really kind of give us any hint of what will come after the Iron Age, which is maybe a good thing. But Ovid, this is just kind of how Ovid seems to be splitting up the concept of history. And if we're thinking about this in regard to the big overarching theme of the Metamorphoses, which is change, then on the small scale, a lot of the stories have ultimately very positive changes or negative changes that end up, you know, working out for the better, or kind of these more gentle forms of change, rather than where he looks at history on the broad scale, he sees this kind of constant negative change. So we're going to focus in this video on Orpheus and Eurydice. Now, your textbook, unfortunately, doesn't give you access to the whole of Book 10. And I think the next time I teach this text, I'm going to find a, you know, complete Book 10 of the Metamorphoses, and we might just read that. So my apologies, I kind of guinea pigged you all a little bit extra on this one. But I had you go ahead and just read a general story version of Orpheus and Eurydice so that you would get a sense for the characters, their struggles, and also because we'll end up reading other versions of this, and it's nice to have one in your back pocket that is kind of like the standard or the original version that is kind of easier to understand, even just linguistically. So the key to Orpheus and Eurydice and Book 10 of the Metamorphoses is these nesting doll stories. Remember that Ovid loves playing with narrative structure. And so kind of his whole thing with Orpheus and Eurydice is that the stories within the story, these are stories that Orpheus is telling in this moment, are all connected to themes in the larger story of Orpheus and Eurydice. So then we have to sort of think about this new narrator then, right? Because we know that Ovid has created a narrator version of himself, of Ovid, to put into the story. But then in Book 10, Orpheus becomes a secondary narrator who is then narrating these other stories from his own perspective rather than from the Ovid narrator's perspective. I should have drawn you a picture of this. So just imagine, there's Metamorphoses overall, slightly smaller circle is the Ovid narrator, slightly smaller circle is the Orpheus narrator, and then we have some stories inside that. So the first story that we get to in that Orpheus tells is the story of Pygmalion, and there are a great number of parallels between the story of Pygmalion and the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. So both men are thwarted in romance. And this one's a bit of a stretch because obviously, Orpheus loses his wife to death, she dies, but Pygmalion loses his access to love kind of through his own, I guess, mistrust of women or his own hatred of women. Especially like he becomes disgusted by the certain group of women who are prostitutes, and he sort of swears off of love forever. And so this almost feels in a way like an externalization of Orpheus's pain, in the sense that like if he's maybe telling this Pygmalion story because he no longer has access to his love, so maybe love in general just isn't worth it anymore. So there's a little bit of an interpretive stretch, perhaps, but there are other more direct parallels between the two stories. In Orpheus and Eurydice, near the end of the story, it's Orpheus's artistic skills that allow him to free Eurydice. It's his musical skills. And then in Pygmalion, it's his artistic skills that allow him to create a love for himself. So both men then are able to re-access love through the use of art. So Pygmalion comes before Orpheus is able to get Eurydice back out of Hades. So really what that functions as is a kind of foreshadowing that turns into parallelism later. So after the story of Pygmalion, the story of Myrrha is told, and Myrrha has some weird kind of family, kind of incestuous stuff going on, but eventually Myrrha is turned into a tree. Now, the reason why she's turned into a tree and why she doesn't get this sort of happy ending is because she is unable to access language. She can't find the words that she needs to say that will fix her problem. And so this also sort of becomes a parallel with Orpheus and Eurydice because he too cannot quite get out the thing that he needs to say. And this is also human failure on the part of Myrrha, and that's what gets Orpheus in trouble. Ultimately, that's why he loses Eurydice for a second time, because where Myrrha is so desperate that she ends up turning into a tree, Orpheus is so desperate to see Eurydice again that he cannot help but look behind him, to look at her, to make sure she's still back there. So, again, this ends up being a kind of foreshadowing and then a kind of parallelism. And in the final story, we see divine failure as well, which, at least for me, when I read this, almost reads as a kind of comfort where maybe because this is Orpheus telling this story, this may be a way for him to provide comfort for himself, but it also may point to kind of Ovid making a larger point where in this Greek mythos, Orpheus can fail, Myrrha can fail, but even the gods can fail because Venus fails her lover Adonis. And so it's sort of almost comforting to think that this kind of thing can happen to anyone, right? So then moving on from Orpheus and Eurydice, we consider this concept of Greek mythology and of heroism. And so we think about heroes in several ways. We think about them as either people who do great deeds or people who are very selfless, and sometimes both. And so in Greek mythology, heroes are considered more on the side of people who kind of do these great deeds. Most Greek heroes also have some kind of deep flaw or kind of tragic problem. So very rarely in Greek mythology do heroes journey into the underworld. And, we talked about this a little bit in class, but, we think about, does this make Orpheus a hero? What differentiates him from a typical hero? How does this play into Ovid's overall themes? And ultimately, was Orpheus's quest worthwhile? So it may make Orpheus a hero because it aligns him with other heroes, that he journeys into the underworld. From our modern perspective, that may not be what makes him a hero. One of the things that seems to differentiate him from a typical hero is that he does ultimately fail in his quest, but also he's not a martial hero. He's not a military or violent or kind of strength-based hero. He is an artist. He's a musician. He is gentle by comparison to someone like Achilles. And so if we're thinking about these overall themes of Ovid, we're thinking about transformation, we're thinking about the power of the arts, the power of love, the tragedy of love. And this is definitely kind of getting into that sort of point where, remember that this was written almost as a response to the Aeneid. If Aeneas is, again, a very violent martial hero, Ovid is almost, one of the things that Ovid may be doing is directly combating that notion that to be a hero, one must be violent. Orpheus, instead of being violent, is artistic. He's gentle. He goes to the underworld for his love, not to conquer the underworld or to fight Hades, but to make a deal wherein he entertains Hades in return for his love. He brings beauty to the underworld. And then ultimately, was Orpheus's quest worthwhile? That's a very personal question. This will vary widely depending on your own vision of what makes something worthwhile. He was able to see Eurydice again. He was able to free her from the underworld once. And although he lost her, he does get to be with her after he dies. So this one really is up to you. And then finally, I want to discuss Pygmalion itself a little bit because there are two very different interpretations of the story. Now, the first interpretation is a very gentle one, and it would suggest that there's an implication here that the power of art is sort of all-encompassing, that there's nothing that love or that art can't bring you, because Pygmalion, through his art, finds himself love. And so the other side of this issue is that there is a suggestion that perhaps this is a little bit of Ovid kind of pointing out the double standards in love, in the sense that, the only love that Pygmalion will accept is the love that he can literally create and have sort of exactly as he wants it. Sort of this idea of how in some way there may be some sense of male fabrication of women, or that there may be some sense of misogyny in that in order for a romantic relationship to work, that the woman must be kind of fully subservient and catering to the male's desires. And this is an idea that Ovid does also play with, because as we know from the context and from some of his other writings, he tends to take a slightly more egalitarian view of love than a lot of other Romans. So this one really is up to you in terms of which way you want to read it, or if you want to read it kind of both. There's an option here, always an option here for both readings to exist at the same time and create a really interesting narrative tension. And maybe that's what Ovid meant, but this one's up to you. So I'll end here, but do bear in mind that this will lead into your response.